this day, in 1826, the Principal Superintendent of Convicts Office released a circular of convicts who had recently absconded from the colony of New South Wales. Of the 43 names listed, 9 had escaped the confines of the fledgling Moreton Bay Penal Settlement. Subsequently published on the 22nd of April 1826 on page 4 of the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser, the circular implored all constables and others to use their utmost exertions in lodging them into safe custody. Amongst those who hailed from Moreton Bay, all were doubly convicted felons, sentenced to transportation for a crime committed in Britain. Each man had been further convicted for misdemeanours committed while serving their initial sentences here in Australia. Of the list of 43 absconded prisoners, William Freeman, William Hartland, Lewis Lazarus, George Mitchell, John Newman, William Pittman, Charles Penny, and James Turner were all initially serving either 7-year, 15-year, or life sentences, and had reoffended via various means once they'd arrived in the colony. On the opening of Moreton Bay Penal Settlement for intake just shy of a year earlier, all were transported north to a new outpost convicts considered a literal hell on earth. However, one additional name stands out on the list, that of John Sterry Baker, and for a very good reason. Baker had arrived in the colony on the 30th of October 1819 via the convict transport the Malabar on the back of a life sentence handed down at the Suffolk Assizes for theft. 5 years later, on the 15th of February 1825, he was issued with a further life sentence for crimes now unclear, and ended up at the newly established Moreton Bay Penal Settlement. Struggling through each day and the regular brutality that ensued, Baker reached the end of his tether on the 8th of January 1826. Absconding from the settlement and fleeing inland, Baker ended up in the Lockyer Valley, lost, alone, naked and starving. Discovered by the local Aborigines, he was mistaken for the ghost of a recently deceased tribe member and was immediately assimilated into their group. Assuming his new identity, Baker quickly learnt the indigenous language and memorised the local areas through which his new mob travelled. He also paid close attention to news passed between indigenous groups regarding the activities of the white men at Moreton Bay, future Brisbane, and Limestone Station, future Ipswich. Quite ironically, as a result of his assimilation and movements, Baker would already have been well versed with the paths leading through the Great Dividing Range, linking the Fassifern Valley and the Darling Downs. According to European history, Alan Cunningham would discover the route in 1828, and to this day the slot between Mount Cordeaux and Mount Mitchell still carries the name Cunningham's Gap. On hearing of the closure of the Moreton Bay Penal Settlement and the advent of free settlement, John Sterry Baker journeyed back to the region. After having lived away from European contact for 14 years, Baker literally walked into the settlement on the 4th of August 1840, announced his arrival and handed himself in as an absconded convict. Like a handful of similar absconded convicts, Baker's Indigenous knowledge was heavily utilised and depended upon in the subsequent development of Brisbane. Similarly to James Davis, an absconded convict who became known as Durham Boy after assimilating into an Indigenous tribe in the Wide Bay Burnett region. Acting as a translator before the courts in a number of cases involving Indigenous prisoners, Baker also played a role in the case of 2 men accused of murder of surveyor-explorer Granville William Chetwynd Stapleton at Mount Lindsay, which both were sentenced to death and hanged from a makeshift gallows affixed to the old windmill on current-day Wickham Terrace. Baker would also share his knowledge gathered during time spent in the bush to aid the last Moreton Bay Commandant, Lieutenant Owen Gorman, to chart a route to the Darling Downs, which to this day is still known as Gorman's Gap and is the oldest gazetted road in Queensland. Baker lived out the rest of his years known as one of Moreton Bay's wild white men, finally passing away on the 17th of January 1860.